All right, so finally we're going to talk about lettrism. Can you tell us what is lettrism in your understanding?
Well, one of the first thoughts that come to mind when I think of lettrism is that the letters themselves individually uh, precede all of the physical creation, and also that they have a meaning unto themselves, and they have numerous characteristics than we are traditionally aware of. Typically, when we look at letters, we look at them as arbitrary. We look at them as strictly phonetic,
Mhm.
to some degree, uh, maybe a grapheme as well. But when I think of lettrism, especially from the perspective of revelation, it is clear to me that it is much more than what we ordinarily think.
Mhm. Yeah, so I guess for those who have probably never heard of the term lettrism, right? For a general audience, I guess we would say that it's basically related to language mysticism or alphabet mysticism, right? Which cuts across any culture, right, or all cultures, right, that are textual. But I think it is also applicable to oral cultures, right? So I think you could apply it to the Gathas of Zoroaster or Zarathustra, which are oral, or the Quran, right, which originally was oral, right? So we're talking about letter mysticism, alphabet mysticism, and right, it can be viewed. We can approach it, right, as you said, looking at letters, something that's written, right, or graphemes. But of course, we can also approach it as something phonetic, right? So the mysticism of the spoken word or language. That's the way I think about it primarily. Um, Before I think of it as having to do with writing, having to do with letters, right? So, for instance, in Judaism, right, the whole tradition there is founded on Genesis 1, which God creates by speaking, right? Not by writing, but by speaking, right? And but in the mystical traditions, like Sefer Yesirah, right, it's explained that what does it mean that God spoke and created the universe? Well, it means that He used the letters of the divine alphabet and combined them in various ways to create the different entities of the universe. And I think Ibn Arabi, right, in Sunni Islam, Sufi mystical thought, right, has the same idea, right? He just thinks of that in terms of Arabic rather than Hebrew. That's all. But it's basically a very similar model. But anyway, um, I have tried to ground lettrism and the mysticism of alphabet and speech, right, in linguistics, right, a serious linguistics. And I do that by starting with Ferdinand de Saussure, right? His, I would call it a dogma, right, or his teaching on the radical arbitrariness, right, of the sign. It has reigned supreme in academia, right, since he promulgated it and it became popular. And that is that, for instance, let's say in English, we have this word tree. And so this word tree, whether it's spoken or written, right, has no natural connection, right, to the actual tree to which the sign or the noun refers. Right. Now, what's very little known fact that towards the end of his career, towards the end of his life, Saussure actually realized that this idea, his theory of the radical arbitrariness of language, cannot be correct. But he didn't publish uh, on this insight, right? And but anyway, someone who's brought attention to that realization, right, of Saussure is, you know, probably our most famous philosopher here in Italy, Giorgio Agamben. And he pointed out that Saussure realized that the radical arbitrariness of language, or the radical arbitrariness of the sign, that this theory he developed cannot be true, because if it were, right, there's no way to get from syntax to semantics, right? From, let's say, like syntax or grammar to conversation, right? What can bridge the gap? There has to be some kind of natural relation involved, right? So maybe it's there's some degree of arbitrariness, right? Certainly some degree of arbitrariness exists in every human language, but the radical arbitrariness, right, it doesn't work, right? And what I mean, a certain degree of arbitrariness, for instance, onomatopoeia, right? So we make up this word buzz for the sound of bees, but if you think about that, right, there's something natural about that, right? Because it actually does sound like, it's trying to sound like the sound that this animal, this creature actually makes, right? But anyway, Saussure realized that the radical arbitrariness of language is not correct, but he could never figure out, you know, what to replace it with. Now, ironically, I suspect that there's the beginning of a replacement is another theory that Saussure developed, but one which he never published, because he was never quite sure that what he was examining and seeing was the result of randomness, right? Or if it was something that actually existed as intentionally. What I'm referring to is this anagram theory, what he called this anagram theory. An example of that, for instance, he noticed things like this in a passage in Homer's Iliad, where Agamemnon comes on the scene. And so we hear or read the name Agamemnon before and after the appearance of Agamemnon. The sounds and the letters of the name Agamemnon begin to proliferate and increase in frequency, right, in different sequences, right? And so he began to see this, that this type of technique was ubiquitous in ancient poetry, classical poetry, Greek and Latin. And again, he thought, well, this looks like an Indo-European, the result of an Indo-European poetic technique. But again, as I said, he could never quite convince himself that what he was seeing was just not noise, just a bunch of randomness. Was it really intentionally this poetic technique? And now we fast forward to the 20th century, and probably the most respected and famous Russian linguist who immigrated to America, and most of his work, you know, is available in English, Roman Jakobson, or Roman Jacobson. He wrote quite a bit about Saussure's anagram theory, and he wasn't timid at all in presenting it as, you know, well-founded. And he was convinced that, you know, what Saussure was seeing was not randomness, but he had a different way of explaining it. He put it this way. He said some of these patterns, you know, a lot of these patterns of letters and phonemes and sounds that Saussure had seen don't necessarily reflect a consciously applied artistic or poetic technique on the part of ancient authors. A lot of these patterns could emanate or originate from the subliminal mind of the poets. So it could reflect a natural aspect of human language, right, which gets intensified, right, by a poet's conscious application, right, of of meter and structure and sound. And so he thought that this technique was actually unconscious, subliminal, that the poets didn't apply or use these techniques consciously, right? It's coming from subliminal influences. I believe he went too far. I think Yakuza went too far. I think that the best explanation is that we're in these examples that Saussure saw, what we see is a combination, right, of subliminal influences and conscious poetic artistry. So it's a combination of conscious and subliminal impulses, right? So I'm suggesting that this Saussure anagram is could be the beginning, if we apply it and take it seriously, it could be the beginning of a replacement for the radical arbitrariness of language. Right? How do you get from syntax to semantics? Well, I think it could be something you do like this, and in linguistics we call this, in cognitive studies we call this phonosemantics, right? So the way that a word sounds, right, has a connection to its meaning, right? And some of the examples of that, a famous experiment that works across human cultures, right, is called the Kiki Booba experiment, right? And so you go to a group of children in a school in Africa or America or Europe, and you're going to get the same result. If you ask them, all right, here's Kiki and Booba, these two words, and now here you give them two illustrations, and one is of a very jagged object and the other is of a very rounded object. And it doesn't matter what society these children will be from, or adults, people will identify the nice and rounded illustration with Booba, and they will identify the jagged illustration with the word Kiki. Right, so this is sort of a fun example, but in recent years, right, there have been many scientific papers published documenting an extensive degree of phonosemantics in human languages across the globe, right? So it used to be in linguistics that the idea of phonosemantics, right, this is very controversial and very disputed, but we can say that it's a fact now, right? And it's just going to take some time for academia to wake up to the fact that this radical arbitrariness of language was a dogma that its creator, Saussure, right, rejected at a certain point. And so what's going to replace it? I think phonosemantics, right? And part of that, an illustration of that would be the Saussure's anagram theory. Right, and so words are rooted in nature, right? Basically, now, right, that's a fundamental tenet, right, of lettrism. Is that the words, right? All mystical approaches to language, whether it be in Islam or Judaism or whatever tradition, they posit that there is a natural correspondence, right, between the word and the object to which it refers, right, the sign pointing to the signified, right? And so although phonosemantics, right, does not prove, right, every aspect of letter mysticism, the foundational concept of letter mysticism and alphabet mysticism is supported by it, right? So I think it's a pretty amazing idea to contemplate, right? So what do you think about all that, Aria?
Well, that's a lot to think about. But I think one of the main points you hit that really resonates with me is this idea, you know, sort of the fallacy of the arbitrariness of language. And I think the corollary to that is that instead of the assumption of randomness and arbitrariness, there ought to be an axiom of meaningfulness or interconnectivity. And sometimes human beings, when we're not able to make sense of something, we will sort of just create a placeholder and call it random or arbitrary. And clearly we see that the emphasis on the letters and just information in general, like that information, just like energy, is one of the foundations of life. And whether it's DNA or whether, you know, it's information being manifested in other ways, there's an organized mechanism at work in every field, whether it's biology or psychology or literacy, language, doesn't matter. There is some way in which everything is connecting, and human beings are always trying to make sense. We are sense makers. We are meaning makers by nature, and it's like we're always trying to convert the chaos into order. It's almost like the law of thermodynamics, except in reverse. Things are, in terms of our psychic capacities and our mental capacities, we're always trying to turn chaos, or what appears to be chaos from a relativistic position, into we're trying to make sense of it. We're trying to connect. And we see this connectivity and this pursuit both in scripture and in science, as you mentioned. And I think it's a great place to bring these conversations together, as opposed to setting them apart. So I think Saussure reached the point where he realized it's not arbitrary. He probably did not have a chance to publish on it in depth.
No, he was getting up in his years.
Yeah, and also perhaps he was worried that, you know, he might be going into mysticism or outside of the academic confinements. And I think a lot of scholars and a lot of academics have that fear. They want to stay in their comfort zone, in their scholarly comfort zone, and whatever they can. It's just like it's like traditional linguistics, you know, really doesn't delve into the question of meaning and semantics that much. It wasn't until like the social turn and the applied linguistics and the anthropological perspectives where they started to look at meaning. It's not that they denied the existence of semantics; it's that they felt like it's too messy. It's not as black and white or scientific, quote unquote, as like the study of phonology or the study of syntax. And I think a lot of those assumptions sort of have been debunked over the last 40 years. So I think this is a good time for a topic like lettrism and linguistics and other scientific approaches to converge. And I think the conversations that we're having and the ones that we did in the conference and in the book that's coming, these will help sort of facilitate those conversations that they might appear messy, but I think they're conversations that help us reach more truer understandings of the nature of things.
Yeah, the project we're working on, the title of the book, right, is the origins and applications of language and number. And if we switch to number, right, which is natural to do when you move from the alphabet, right, to number, because in ancient systems, right, the letters of the alphabet functioned as numbers, right? So in Hebrew, Aleph, the first letter was 1, and etc. Right. So when we switch to numbers, right, and then that's soon going to land us in the realm of math and maths and arithmetic, right? And so the standard modern definition of that is it's the study and search for structure and pattern. Right, that's what mathematics is, right? And so if we just stop and think about it, then of course, this is cosmic in scope, the entire universe, no matter what we can think of, right? Everything that exists has a structure and has a pattern, right? From the unseen to the visible scale, right? And so we can find structure in dance. We can find it in architecture. We can find it in physics. We can find it in writings. There's an interesting scientific study that was done by a number of physicists 7-8 years ago, examining about 100 pieces of classical literature. And they discovered that, especially works like stream of consciousness works like Finnegan's Wake, right, has these tremendous natural fractal structures built into them, right? So everything has structure. And so it is a challenge, right? Let's when we look at ancient literature, and we look at modern literature too, but most people look at ancient literature for these purposes, and trying to find or examine numerical patterns, right, or letter patterns, right? So this is done a lot with the Bible and the Qur'an increasingly in more recent years. Then the challenge becomes, how can we identify the difference between something that was put there intentionally by the author and then something that may be random, right? Because it's just, we tend to impose order even when there may not be order, right? But in any case, if we ground things in Saussure's anagram theory and in the fact of phonosemantics, right, at least we have some criteria to start with, right? And we can create, an academic, a rigorous scholarly discipline, right, on, how to deal with looking for patterns, right, wherever that may be. I think for me especially, I think for you as well, but for me especially, what I'm most interested in are these phonetic and letter and numerical patterns, right, in literature, ancient literature to medieval times, like the Bible, the Quran, but certainly not limited to those, right? But when it comes to the Quran, I'll point something out, right? Now, no one doubts it in the Hebrew Bible, for instance. I mean, anyone in the field knows that there are some numerical patterns in it, which everyone would agree on, and there are letter patterns like acrostic poems that are self-evidently, intentional, right? And but with the Quran, we're usually told now there are no acrostics in the Quran. There might be, well, there definitely are like symbolic numbers in the Quran, right? I mean, the number 7 is important in the Quran, and other numbers as well. But what I've been doing in the last couple of years, right, with the help of software databases, right, is searching for letter patterns and acrostics and acronyms, right, encryptions, I call them, in the Quran, because I like to be skeptical, right? If my teacher tells me, well, there are no acrostics in the Quran, you can find those in the Bible, but there aren't any in the Quran. Well, I think everyone should be skeptical about what they're told. And, all right, so let's test this and see if it's in fact true. Has anyone ever searched the Quran, right, for encrypted letter patterns or acrostics? Right? Of course they haven't, right? Because everyone's been told they're not there. But no one's looked for them. And why? It's an assumption. They're told they're not there because the Quran was delivered as an oral text, and acrostics belong to, it's a literary technique. It's something that you find in textual literature, written literature composed as a text. But we know that's just simply not true, right? We have acrostics in Zarathustra's Gathas. Martin Schwartz, right, the emeritus professor of Iranian studies at the University of California at Berkeley, right, has published a lot on this, showing these acrostics in the Gathas. But these are oral texts like the Quran, right? So I'll point one out that I like. You find this about 7, maybe up to 10 times, maybe 7, 8 times, definitely in the Quran. It's usually in the first or second ayah, opening up a surah, and we have this phrase, tilka ayatu katabi, right? So those are the signs or the letters of the book, right? Now, if you look at that, of course, it's easier to see it written, right? You'll see that the last letter of each of those words, right, would be tilka, that's a kaf, and then ayatu, that's the ta, and then katabi, that's the ba. You put them together, you get the word kitab, which is the last word in that sequence of 3 words, right? So now orally, if you think this is intentional, you can play around with it and you can repeat it, and you can then begin to realize, oh, these encryptions are possible orally. Someone delivering this type of oral acrostic or acronym, right, would just put a certain extra emphasis on these words. And that would be the cue for the audience to know that there's a deeper level of text. There's a subtext or a sub-orality, right, going on. Tilka ayatu kitab, something like this. It's relatively easy. But what's really significant about this is that phrase, those are the letters of the book or the revelation, because ayat can literally mean sign, but a sign is a letter also, right? Right. So, and the reason I translated letter in this instance is because it says it's referring to the disconnected letters which occur right before it. And I think in the first time this occurs in the Quran is Alif Lam Mim Tilka Ayatu Kitabi. So Alif Lam Mim, those are the letters of the heavenly book. Ooh, that's amazing, when you read it that way, because ever since the beginning of Islam, people have argued back and forth and wandered and racked their brains. What are these strange letters? And yet this verse, it's telling us many things. First of all, it's telling us, well, it's a part of the actual text, right? The oral text. It's not just like abbreviations of the scribe, right? Or something like this. Right, because it says Alif Lam Mim, those are the letters of the revelation. Wow. Okay, I'll give you one other example. Right, in the 42nd surah, that's the 31st surah I was talking about. The 42nd surah starts off with, this is very unique in the Quran, because it has 5 disconnected letters. All right, so Surah 19, Surah Maryam, I believe, has 5 also, but they're in a single ayah. For some reason, in Surah 42, these 5 disconnected letters are divided into 2 ayat. I don't know why, but it makes it unique. But it's Ha, Mim, Ain, Sin, Qaf. And then it says, Dalika, right, which means thusly, or this is the way, or this is how. Right, ka and dhalika, right? So ka is basically how, and dhalika means that way, or that, or those, right? So referring, not that, but those, right? So in that way, we have inspired you, the Prophet of Islam, and those prophets who were before you. In what way? How? By means of those 5 letters. Well, it doesn't, I'm sure it should be quite obvious that it doesn't mean by those 5 letters and only those 5 letters, but it means by disconnected letters in general, right? Any of these disconnected letters, that is how we inspire you. That's how we give you this revelation, and that's how we gave revelation to, or inspiration, I should say, to the prophets before you. So what the way I understand that is at least it's a theory, is that, all right, so the heavenly book, right, that tilka ayatu katabi, those are the letters of the heavenly book. The heavenly book actually, right, it's pre-verbal, right? And so, but when it descends into the state or level of creation, into the mind of a prophet, right? There's an intermediate stage where the prophet clothes this wordless revelation. Then the first stage of that are these disconnected letters. And then those develop further into fully formed sentences and discourses. All right. So but you can't get to the fully formed proclamation, right, without going through that intermediary stage of the disconnected letters, sort of like an infant learning to babble, right? And then eventually gets to fully formed, semantics and grammatical statements, right? But the Surah 42, these disconnected letters, and that is how we inspire you and how we inspired the prophets before you, right? And so talk about lettrism, right? All right, I promise that's the only example, but there's one more, because this is a good example of the Saussurean anagram, right? And this is just to show scholars out there that what Saussure found in classical poetry, in Latin poetry and Greek poetry, you find it in the Quran as well. And you can see it in Surahs 86 and 87. Right, so Surah 87 is named after a name of God in the first ayah, Ali, the Most High. Now, if you notice the last several ayat in the preceding Surah 86, and you look at the last letter of each of those, I don't know what it is, 7 or 8 final verses, you'll see that all of those letters that end each of those verses are the letters of that divine name, right? That is now a title of the very next surah, right? And so it's not like an acrostic where it's an exact spelling, encrypted exact spelling of the word, but it's like the letters of that word proliferating in different sequences, right? So it may not always be in perfect sequence. It may be out of sequence, right? But this is the Saussurean anagram, so it's in the Quran. You can find it in the Quran, and this is what I hope a future generation of scholars and students of the Quran, will begin to apply, the knowledge we have of the Saussurean anagram to, text, even oral text like the Quran.
Yeah, I think one of the points that I think that was really fascinating for me is that these letters, especially from the very beginning, you mentioned some examples about the word ayat meaning letters, or signs and symbols, which essentially that's what letters are. They're signs and symbols, and they're serving an indexical function of pointing to something higher. And I think this idea of the pre-verbal, or language that precedes sort of form, and has a form in time and space, is very essential, is very important, because obviously these communications originate from a non-temporal, non-spatial reality, and or what we can call a metaphysical reality, and they're manifesting into this world in a particular order, with time and space timestamps, if you will. And for me, one of the places where I sort of saw this both in the Bible and in the Quran was the spelling of the name of Abraham. I don't know if you noticed, but in the Quran, there's also, in some of the manuscripts, there's different spellings of his name. So
sure.
In some places it's Abram, if I recall, in Surah Al Imran, it's without the Ya, and then in Surah Baqarah it has the Ya. And a lot of people, especially in the Muslim world, who don't have a letrist perspective, might look at this as just a simple editorial mistake, or this is a spelling mistake. But a letrist perspective can help us take a different angle on this and look at the intentionality of the different spellings of his name. And this is very clear in the Bible, because we know when Abram's name was changed to Abraham with the hey,
Right.
this was a very deliberate move. It's almost like, somebody achieving a new degree or a new certification. We see that with the change in the name of Sarai, from Sarai to Sarah. We see at the end when Moses changes Joshua's name from Hosea to Joshua, and there's so many discussions about these name changes, that these names are not just arbitrary labels, but they're actually representative of a rank, a spiritual rank. And so why couldn't the same thing, I mean, obviously the Quran is supposed to be a continuation of previous revelations, then there should be something intentional and conscious about the spelling changes or the name changes. And as you said, the Quran is primarily an oral communication, but still in the written form is a reflection of the oral. And so and in some ways it's as if the Quran is drawing our attention to the importance of the letters by starting so many chapters with the letters, the discrete letters, the muqata'at. And so rather than take a stance of not pursuing the meaning of these letters, I think we should be trying to make sense of it and look for these underlying patterns. And I think we would have much more of a continuous understanding from all the divine revelations. And I think there's also another important point for me practically, which is a pedagogical one. And that is the intersection of the numeric values of the letters and the sounds. And that is sort of how we see the various disciplines like mathematics and the language arts being integrated as opposed to being separated.
Right.
And I think we can learn a lot about content integration in the very nature of the letters that have been presented from a letrist point of view.
One of my first discoveries in the Quran, right, when I got a hold of these databases from my friend and colleague Keith Yoder, I was looking for letter patterns and number patterns, because you can do both types of searches in these software databases. Was in the Quran was pertaining to this name Ibrahim or Abraham. This is Surah Baqarah, the second surah of the Quran. Right, so this occurs. There's this very significant passage, and it's ayat, that is verses 258, 259, and 260. This is like a paragraph, right? That is its own section. And in the first ayah of that 3-ayat block, there's something unique, right, that doesn't occur anywhere else in the Quran, and that is that the name Abraham is mentioned 3 times. Right? The next verse, number 259, the name Abraham does not occur. And then in the final verse there, 260, we have the name Abraham occurring again. And it's all this conversation between God and Abraham about the topic of resurrection. So that's what's going on there. But I noticed there's something curious about the enumeration of those ayat. Right. This at least is in Hafs, right? Because the number of the verses, right, is going to vary according to the recitation. Like in the Warsh, It's one off there, right? But it's overlapping, right, with some crucial numbers. And what is that? Well, what we call the plane spelling, right? The full spelling of Ibrahim, if I'm not mistaken, right? The numerical value would be 258. Is that right?
I think so.
And with but if you add the medial aleph, and that's what's missing, right, in a lot of manuscripts. But I think it's 258. If you add the medial aleph, then it's 259. Right, that's right. And so this three block passage starts with Ayah 259. So that really stood out to me. And then what stood out to me is, that's curious, because I believe it's Ayah 200, the 259. So the second Ayah in that three Ayah block has 249 letters. Well, in Hebrew, the name Abraham, right, has numerical value of 248, right? So one less in rank than these 249 letters. Mm-hmm. However, if you just apply, as in Arabic there, the medial aleph, and you apply an aleph in the middle of Hebrew Avraham, that'll take it up to 249. So it's as if the author there is thinking of two different numerical values for the name of Abraham. Ibrahim, which can be 258 or 259, depending on whether you want to have the medial aleph, and in Hebrew, right? But spelled, or pronounced with emphasis on the Ibrah, Avrahim, right? With the aleph in the right after the resh. That's, to me, was the first case to me that it's like, yeah, it looks really pretty clear to me that that's intentional. There's something going on with playing around with even putting verses in where there will be in a specific number which agrees with the numerical value of the prominent prophetic name that is the subject of the text. And so there you have something going on simultaneously with the letters and with numbers, right? Because each letter has a gematria value, as they say.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And the numerical interest, right, is also plain in that Ayah 260, where Abraham's not mentioned. The name Abraham's not mentioned, but the number 100 years is mentioned, right? Right. So, I mean, there's this interest in numbers throughout that whole section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, I've always wondered why this angle on the scriptures has been sort of overlooked or even frowned upon, especially over the last 800 years or so. I mean, we see like this line of inquiry is either deemed heretical or,
blasphemous, magic.
Blasphemous, and I've thought about why this is. Why are people being discouraged from looking for these patterns, looking for trying to crack these codes, if you will, or and it's sort of, for me, it comes down to it's an issue of power and control. It's something political going on, where if people were to know or discover these underlying patterns or look for these underlying patterns, then that somehow from a religious point of view they will not be controlled as much, or I think it's something really curious for me. It baffles me that this whole approach has not really been taken up. And those who did take it up, especially in the Muslim world, like Ibn Arabi or Hallaj, or the names go on, they have been severely persecuted.
Yes. Well, yeah, Ibn Arabi, managed to keep his head, but Al-Khalaj, of course, lost his life. He got strung up, for this way of thinking, and but it's again, right, to again, to emphasize that there is a way to approach this, right, from a rigorous academic with a rigorous academic methodology, right? So of course, it's, for some people it would be easy to get lost in all of this, and they could lose themselves and start seeing all kinds of patterns where they're maybe not there, right? So that, but that only points out the need. All the more, it points out the need for the creation, right, of a rigorous scholarly academic methodology. How do we apply these tools, and how do we identify these patterns, right? And just demonizing it and calling it magic, or calling it just something in people's imaginations, right, is not helpful, right? If we can show, right, with a good number of very strong cases that are very obvious, I think the ones we've been talking about are pretty obvious, and so if we can convince a good number of scholars, yeah, there's something there, these patterns are actually there, well, then what needs to be done is these types of scholars, right, need to jump on board and help in the creation and formation of a very rigorous methodology, right, on how to apply this, right? So it's just not fantasy.
Sure.
It's just not mystical ravings, right? This is something objective. It's actually there. It's something that can be investigated and looked for and tested, right? But
I think that might be the epistemological payoff, that to take an objective scientific approach to something that's seen as more subjective, or perhaps unreachable. I think one of the things about lettrist and lettrism that I see is that we can converge the scientific, and the symbolic, the semantic and the structure. These things can be brought together in communication with each other, and I think that's one of the great benefits. And I think perhaps there also might be a hesitancy for those who are really sort of conditioned by secular academic environments to make that connection to something that's sort of deemed as like mystical or religious, or not scientifically approachable. I think this is very consequential, what you're saying.
Right. Well, as I say, I mean, there's so much being published on lettrism, especially on Islamic texts and mystical texts and all this. Literally thousands and thousands upon thousands of pages being published, right, by many scholars on on lettrism. But so far there is no, and I mean published, by academic presses like Brill, for instance. So serious scholarship, right? Trying to interpret and understand what all these lettrist authors and mystics were thinking, right? So not necessarily trying to argue that this is all true and spiritually insightful and all this, but just just standard historical approach to pre-modern texts. All right. So what are these pre-modern texts about? What are the ideas, development, background? But there's nothing being done on from an academic standpoint on trying to ground some of these letrist ideas, right, in rigorous, actual, factual, right, linguistics and psychology. And of course, that's what I'm trying to do. And by invoking Saussure's anagram theory and phonosemantics, and these, so we can actually ground some of this, right, in known science, right? And of course, this doesn't mean that the spiritual and religious ideas in those pre-modern texts are not interesting, right, and significant and important within themselves, right? But there's the role for the theologian, right? Sure, that there's a role for a theologian, but there's also a role for the rigorous scientific approach, right, to these texts, and to recognize that a lot of what this letter mysticism and alphabet mysticism, I say phonetic mysticism as well, right, is sort of grounded in known facts. The Saussurean anagram and phonosemantics, right? So there's a lot that can be done. So we need scientific approach to understand these texts in themselves, and then of course, right, there's a role for theologians and others who want to explore the value, right, of the ideas themselves, right, and the way that the authors, those original authors, right, viewed what they were composing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, this was a great start to a great discussion.
Yes.
I look forward to continuing it. Perhaps we can go through some examples next time.
Sure.
Of what we're talking about.